This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, my name's Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, we're here, as the title suggests, to talk about films, the stories of films, how films came to be. I talk production stories, development stories, release stories, marketing stories, casting stories, all sorts, really. All those little facets, those small decisions, those small moments that go to make the films that we know and love. Just that, the films that we know and love. Well, sometimes love. The films I tend to pick for this podcast, if you're here for the first time, welcome. If you're returning, welcome. They have a mainstream leaning. They tend to be films I have some degree of investment or interest in. I don't do snark. Lots of that elsewhere if you're in the market for some snark. Instead, I just talk 2 films per episode and then get out of your way. So without further ado, I'm going to play you a clip from the first of the 2 films I'm going to chat about. I'm going to pick up the story the other side of this.
Warner Brothers presents
Say, would you get off my golf course? I am.
the story of an everyday guy who refused
Fine. Baby, whoa.
to take it one more day.
So we got a nutcase with a bag full of guns. He's in Hollywood right now, and he's heading west.
I don't know if you've noticed or not, but there's other people waiting to use the phone here.
Now, if you go up against this guy, be careful.
I think it's out of order.
And that then was a clip from the promo for 1993's Falling Down. This one directed by Joel Schumacher, written by Ebba Rose Smith. The cast led, of course, by Michael Douglas and Robert Duvall. Barbara Hershey in the ensemble there as well. Ebba Rose Smith himself pops up as Guy on Freeway in this one. And it was with him that this particular project came about in the first place. So for this one, we need to go back to really the start of the 1990s. And at that stage, Ebba Rose Smith was primarily an actor, and he was living and trying to work in the Los Angeles area. He was picking up bit parts. He was a regularly working actor, but he was picking up fairly low profile parts in the likes of Turner and Hooch, which I've covered on a previous Film Stories podcast. He was Russian number 2 in Outrageous Fortune. Quite a long list of television work as well. But one day, I mean, it was pretty well known with all the development and construction that was going on around Los Angeles at that time, that the traffic jams were monstrous. I'm sure they're not a great deal better now, but at that point they were absolutely monstrous. And one day he was stuck in a traffic jam and just got the thought in his head, wouldn't it be great just to leave the car there and just walk away from it, just walk completely away from the queue and just leave everything behind. And that was the genesis really of that germ of an idea that would become his screenplay. He also threw in 1 or 2 other influences. I mean, there was a story of a man who in 1988 was driving his tractor, and he took to the Hollywood freeway and rammed over 20 cars just because he got so frustrated at the traffic, at sitting in endless queues. And so Smith also discovered various other crimes of frustration, and he set about turning this into a script, and that script would of course become Falling Down. He considered a couple of different locations for the film. So New York was one fairly obvious possible for it, but this was very clear very early on that this was a Los Angeles story. And in the context of cinema at the time, I mean, I think back to Mick Jackson's LA story written by and starring Steve Martin, and what a love letter to the city that was. That was only a year or 2 before. But Smith wasn't looking to make that film. Instead, he settled on Los Angeles. Primarily, he lived in Los Angeles. He had first-hand knowledge of the traffic frustration there. He found not unreasonably, I suspect he felt that was a universal problem that pretty much everyone could relate to. But also he knew that the resultant film could then be pretty loyal to the geography of Los Angeles too. So he put that screenplay together, and even though the film really came together quite quickly in the end, it would be fair to say that Hollywood studios were not falling over themselves to pick up what was pretty much a live wire of a screenplay. I mean, Falling Down was and is a contentious and controversial film, and it was perceived by many Hollywood studios to be a dangerous one. What's the point of tackling that? You're pretty much just asking for trouble. It was in part, though, producer Arnold Kopelson who had become interested in it, and he kept trying to sell the film. He felt there was something in it, and it got to the point where there was so little studio interest in there that it was he was at one stage thinking of just pitching this out to be a television movie rather than a cinematic production. But the turning point, well, one of the turning points of this particular story was Michael Douglas, because this was the 1990s, particularly the early 1990s, was still an era where a movie star had the clout to pretty much instantly get a movie made. That if you were a star of a certain cachet and a certain profile and with a commercial track record to back it up, people would be more likely to take a risk on your films. You couldn't imagine that happening now, but at this point, Douglas's interest was what really rocket fueled the studio interest ultimately in the movie. But there were other personnel questions and options available, and it's worth just going through those, because there's a story that, for instance, the late Dennis Hopper was one potential director who was mooted for the film. I couldn't find much to back this up, but he would be an interesting choice. But also Hopper was notoriously a difficult director. I mean, a difficult person, I think it would be fair to say. But his directorial career post Easy Rider was troublesome. There were an assortment of casting options as well. The lead character in Falling Down is known ultimately on screen as Defense, after the number plate on his car, and that character, well, there were some names just tossed around. I mean, the character's in his 30s, so not all of these would have fit, but Jack Nicholson's name was mentioned, Ed Harris's name was in there, Alec Baldwin, Michael Keaton, Harrison Ford, who was linked to pretty much every high-profile male lead role in the 90s, he was in there, although Ford was reticent to take risky roles, as he would prove with Traffic, which I've discussed previously, where he ultimately turned that role down. Robin Williams was also a candidate in there, and this was before he was taking on some of the darker roles that he took later on in his career. But at this point, Joel Schumacher had come on board to direct the film. He was interested in the movie, and Schumacher's career was in a good place. That he came to Falling Down after he'd done Flatliners in 1990. 1991's Dying Young hadn't done particularly well, but he was nonetheless a man with a track record of films that had done well. So Lost Boys had done well, St Elmo's Fire had done well. So it's relatively early still in his movie directing career, but Schumacher, it turned out, it got to the point where Schumacher was going to direct the movie, and Schumacher knew Michael Douglas, and it was reportedly Schumacher who thus got the script to Michael Douglas. Now, Douglas himself was in an interesting place at the point that he took hold of the screenplay to Falling Down. That was primarily because he was just so busy that the year before, he'd shot 2 films, one of which had been a hit, one of which hadn't. So one of them was Shining Through, the other was Basic Instinct. I think I can leave you to work out which of those 2 films particularly cut through. And he was looking to take a break from acting. I think he was one of those actors who came up with the I'm looking to take a year off, that hugely relatable thing where you can take a year off work. I might do that. I can't do that. But Douglas saw the script and changed his mind, even though he was pretty flat out exhausted from making 2 films pretty much back to back and then promoting them and doing all the work involved. And I'm not denigrating that work at all, to be clear. He read this script and was utterly taken by it. He thought it was one of the best scripts that he'd written. Now, originally, he was given the script with the idea that he would take on the role of the older character, Lester Prendergast, ultimately played by Robert Duvall. Other names in the list for that at that point were the likes of Gene Hackman, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman was in there, Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon both in there too. But Douglas was taken with the role of D-Fens. That was the part that he wanted to play, and he expressed interest in the film, signed on the dotted line to take the lead role, and studio interest suddenly awoke at that point. Now, playing opposite him would be Robert Duvall, who was cast in the role. And Duvall himself brought with him a reputation for sometimes being a bit difficult, for having a little bit of a temper. And it turned out that before shooting began, and this is detailed in a terrific new book by Paul Hirsch called A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far Away. I'm going to come back to that shortly. He talked about how Schumacher basically gave Duvall a pep talk before production began, saying he could behave however he wanted to prepare him for his performance. And he basically gave Duvall carte blanche to lose his temper, to do whatever he needed to do. Think a little bit of reverse psychology in Schumacher's approach there. And it worked. That Duvall was particularly, I'm like to say well behaved, but he was no trouble through the production, and of course put in a terrific performance as well. With the cast in place of Douglas and Duvall, then the budget was brought together. That Warner Brothers became involved at this point. Arnold Copperson persuaded Warner Brothers, where he'd set up films before, to back the project, and Warner Brothers stumped up a budget to the tune of $25 million. So it was still not a massive production, but a sizable one, and it was Douglas's profile that really had got that over the line. The fact that Douglas was about to have one of the biggest hits of his career with Basic Instinct, I'm not sure that could have hurt too much. With everything in place, therefore, production was set for 1992, and actually the movie would shoot between the end of March 1992 and I think it wrapped up the 11th of June of that year. So some way in advance of when the film actually made it into cinemas, but it was a bit of a difficult production just to get that far anyway, because Falling Down was shot on location. It had to be shot on the streets of Los Angeles. It's the old, sounds like a pretentious cliche, isn't it, when someone says a city or a location is a character in a film. But I think there's a justification in saying that in the case of Falling Down. And they wanted to be geographically loyal to Los Angeles as well to make the story plausible. The story is contained within a day. And so they set about answering the question really, how do you film this movie in an already gridlocked Los Angeles, where basically you want to film gridlock scenes that in turn will create more gridlock, and that presented more than a few headaches, as did the bubbling tensions within Los Angeles anyway. That in the midst of production on the film, the Rodney King verdict was handed down, which in turn led to riots in the Los Angeles area, which in turn shut down filming for a couple of days. And going back to Paul Hirsch's book, one of the things that he notes in there is, in the aftermath of the Los Angeles riots, the question was asked of director Joel Schumacher, do you want to go and get footage of the aftermath of these riots to include in the movie, to add a bit more plausibility, a bit more a bit more oomph to it? And Schumacher just flat out refused. He said he didn't want to take advantage of the misfortunes of others and basically what they were going through. There was one location that was slap bang in the middle of where the riots were taking place, and it's the Whammy Burger location, which was a redressed real burger joint in the Los Angeles area. And the set had been dressed and rebranded, ready for the film, and it basically stood unused for days in the middle of production. There's a great look back on the film on a website called LA Taco, which I hugely recommend. And it talks about how this burger bar was just sat there, and they were just crossing their fingers that it wouldn't get wrecked in the middle of the riots that were taking place. As it turned out, they weren't. But while it was intact and they were able to come back to it, while the riots were unable to film on location, what they did do is they went back to Warner Brothers and did some on-set work there, but still, this was always going to be a very outdoor film. So that opening freeway sequence, for instance, which is really sets the tone perfectly for the movie. You get Douglas in his car with his crew cut, which was the haircut was suggested by Joel Schumacher. He has those glasses, and when the glasses get the crack in them, that is a deliberate tip of the hat, as you might expect, to the film Straw Dogs. But the need to shoot that freeway sequence on location brought with it headaches that basically, in the end, what they got is they got permission to shoot it over 2 weekends at the closest they could get to off-peak times, and they had to capture everything in that point. And it's quite a prolonged opening sequence in the film as well, and they had these 2 short windows of opportunity to get that. But then this was, in its own way, quite an economical film in terms of the amount of shooting that was completed on it. Partly as a degree of the circumstances in which the film was put together, because Falling Down, I hadn't really considered this, I stopped and thought about it preparing for this. Falling Down is an outdoor film that takes place in daytime, that there are no night scenes in the movie. The entirety of the movie is around the Los Angeles area on a given day, and one of the consequences of that was that the filming day, that whilst on some sets film crews might be expected to work 16, 17, 18 hours a day to get a movie in the can, there's no point to that with Falling Down, and apparently most days filming on the movie was completed by 6 o'clock, and people just got to go home and have some kind of life outside of the production of a film. Schumacher himself was said to be incredibly well prepared for this. I'm not suggesting he wasn't on other films, in case you're taking implications there, but the level of preparation that Schumacher put in meant he came to his locations knowing exactly what he wanted to get and pretty much got it. And he was shooting little more, according to Paul Hirsch, who again edited the film, little more than about 30 minutes of footage every day, which is low by the standards of a big Hollywood production. But there was one slight exception to that, and again, I do want to give credit to the book A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away, which I hugely recommend. There's loads more stories from Falling Down in there, but this one is fascinating, I think, in that there's actually one shot in the film that's still out of focus, and it was a shot that Joel Schumacher took had four runs at, which was more takes than he would usually do on a sequence. And it's the moment in the film where the character of Defense makes a phone call to his ex-wife, and as Hirsch describes it, it's a single slow camera move tracking through a smoke-filled light across the bric-a-brac in the back room of a store, gradually pushing in till we're at a tight close-up of Douglas's face at the end, and it's a couple of minutes shot, but every single take of that was slightly out of focus. But Schumacher, and this was right near the end of the production, and Schumacher had gone off to shoot episodes of a television soap by the name of 2000 Malibu Road at this point, and he was off doing some location scouting, preparing for that. And so when they went to look at the daily footage of that film, his team noticed it was out of focus. But as Hirsch describes in his book, there was a cost sometimes to being the person to point out things that had gone wrong to Schumacher. That without wishing to put words in people's mouths, he could be quite a difficult person to deliver the bad news to. And Schumacher, of course, caught up with this footage a little bit later and noticed that the shot of Douglas was out of focus in the film. And he asked his assembled team, why did this happen? Who spotted it? Why didn't someone bring it to their attention? And Hirsch describes how ultimately it was left to him to tell Schumacher that he was a difficult person to break the news to. Schumacher rejected this, and to quote just the one sentence at the end of this little bit of passage in the book, the shot remains out of focus, and you can see that in the final film. The movie, though, came together and was readied for its release in the US on the 26th of February 1993, and it turned out to be a film that created, let's make no bones about this, something of an impact. That it was released, less than a year after the Los Angeles riots had taken place anyway, and still tensions were bubbling in the aftermath of that, and this $25 million movie movie, went into cinemas at the end of February 93. It was up against the likes of, there were holdover releases of Groundhog Day, Homeward Bound, The Incredible Journey was in there, Aladdin was still in there, A Few Good Men was still floating around, but it opened at number one at the box office and created something of a sensation. It opened to 8.7 million in the US, and ultimately in the States it would make $40 million off that 25 million production budget. It would go on to make, we wouldn't get it in the UK for a couple of months afterwards, and it would go on to be a decent hit over here as well. But it was the aftermath of Falling Down that was equally as interesting, because it's a contentious film, and there were depictions in the film that caused a great deal of discomfort for certain communities. Notorious is a sequence in the film where a Korean grocer finds himself on the receiving end of the character of Defen's wrath and racist abuse, and this caused all kinds of outcry, not unreasonably. And Douglas, reflecting on the role in a piece with Entertainment Weekly in 2015, says that the Korean Grocers Association got in touch with Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers in turn got in touch with Douglas, and a meeting took place at the studio, and Douglas said, so we had a conversation. I told them, look, I'm very sorry, but there's a reason the screenwriter picked certain things to put in the film, but still the unhappiness, again not unreasonably, carried on to the point where Warner Brothers in Korea cancelled the Korean release of the movie. Such was against threats of a boycott of the film. There was further upset too. The character of Defense in the movie is an unemployed defence worker, and unemployed defence workers protested the film as well. Talking to Entertainment Weekly back in 1993, Bill Soveroff of the National Centre for Career Change was concerned about the stigma, and he said, quote, we issued a laid off workers survival guide, and street fighting is not one of the tips, unquote. And just that whole feeling of will this kind of portrayal have some ramifications. And it's important to note, as that Entertainment Weekly article note, this was originally a more upbeat film than the one we got. And to quote that 1993 article, quote, originally planned as an upbeat HBO film, the movie got close to Schumacher's mad as hell vision of America with the studio's full cooperation. No two ways about it though. Falling Down in the Warner Brothers pantheon, it was a success. That Douglas ranked the film as and his role as one of the best he'd ever done. I think there's a story that Kirk Douglas said at that point that it was his favourite of his son's roles, and it would start for Joel Schumacher as well. An incredible run really at Warner Brothers that was only came to an end with 1997's Batman and Robin, but between 1993 and 1997 he was doing a film a year for the studio, and the vast majority was successes. So in 94 he went from Falling Down to doing The Client, based on the John Grisham book. Then he did Batman Forever in 95. Then he did A Time to Kill in 96. And Joel Schumacher was a really important go-to director for Warner Brothers, and it was Falling Down that in part cemented that reputation. Of course, 1997's Batman and Robin would derail that. For screenwriter Eber Rose Smith, though, he would ultimately return to acting. He just wrote two more screenplays that were published, the last being the primarily forgotten film, really, Car 54, Where Are You? I've not seen it, so I can't give you any value or qualitative judgment on the film, but this was really his one high-profile screenplay, and it's interesting. It's such a profile, it had such impact that the think pieces about Falling Down and the ramifications of Falling Down are still being felt and talked about to a degree to this day. Could you see a film like it getting through a major studio now? I couldn't. But in 1993, that was the power of a movie star. That was the power of a producer willing to basically go around the studios and rattle the tins and see what was available. And it turned out to be just that old cliche of the film, pretty much the right film at the right time for how the world was. A remake in the current day, I mean, crikey, that would be terrifying. And that brings us to the halfway point of the latest episode of Film Stories. So a couple of requests, if you don't mind, while I've got your ear. If you could please leave a review, ideally a very positive review for this podcast at your podcast repository of choice. That helps me enormously. Likewise, if you can subscribe, that helps with all the posh algorithms and sends me up charts, and then more people notice it, and then everyone's really happy. I am. This is a fully independent podcast. My magazines are fully independent as well, and And so it's your word of mouth, it's you spreading the word that's the only thing that keeps me going, that and coffee and wine. So I hugely thank you for your support. I'm going for the second of the two films I'm talking about in this Film Stories, though. I'm going for a more upbeat film, a more recent film. It might be a film that quite a few of you haven't had the pleasure of yet. I'm not going to spoil it. I do hugely recommend it. I am going to tell you the story behind it, the other side of this clip.
We need to form a band.
Connor's putting a band together.
Oh, good Jesus.
You play every instrument known to mankind.
Probably.
Show 'em.
It's all about the girl, isn't it?
What's this?
Homework.
I have school in the morning.
This is school. Rock and roll is a risk. You risk being ridiculed.
Jesus, what are you all wearing?
Yeah, we're just working that out.
That then is a very, very welcome clip from 2016 Sing Street, directed by John Carney, written by Carney as well, with story credit also going to Simon Commodi. The stars of this one: Ferdia Walsh-Pilo, Kelly Thornton, Maria Doyle-Kennedy, Jack Rayner, Aidan Gillen, Lucy Boynton. Primarily at that point quite a low profile cast, but then Carney, to a degree really, was the star here, that he was the person who brought Once to the big screen, a film that forever will be associated with him, partly to his frustration, I think. He'd also followed that up with Begin Again in 2013, starring Mark Ruffalo, Keira Knightley in that one as well, and Hayley Steinfeld. And he was keen, after his experience on Begin Again, to come back to Ireland and to tell a story in and around Ireland as well. And I remember around the time of Sing Street's release, there were a lot of comparisons and questions being asked about parallels to The Commitments, which is a film I'm going to come to in a future episode of Film Stories. But they're very different films, as Carney had to point out in interviews an awful lot. Now, the movie made it into cinemas in 2016, but work on the movie, well, it went back some way before that. And before the footage was shot, the songs for the film were coming together. Now, I'm jumping a little bit ahead there, because in terms of the basis of it, what Carney wanted to do with this film was put together a story that had a light autobiographical touch to it, that was in part based on his experiences growing up in Ireland, and that he talked around the time of the film's release, that through school he'd been bullied and music was his way through that, and he used music as a way to try and impress a girl at school too. But conversely, the screenplay that he would put together wouldn't be a straight biopic. That's not what he was looking to do. That the whole family element of the movie changed quite a lot from his. But he also said that he'd actually come up with the story several years before starting to write it down. And he was on a tube in London, and he just watched a young man with his guitar and his friend, and just saw that they were just enjoying themselves and just having a lot of fun just playing music together. And he just thought, well, there's the genesis of a film there, and he took that as the basis of it. Now, originally the film Sing Street is very strong on the theme of brothers and why brothers matters, but that wasn't really there at the start of the development of the movie. Instead, what Carney was zeroing in on was this idea of a kid who basically puts together a band to solve his problems in life, and that's how his screenplay started to come together. And he got to a point where towards the end of 2013 that the film was readying, that he started to pull the financing together, and it was clear that this was going to move forward. He was going to be able to shoot it in Dublin, but he needed the music first. And so this is one of those instances where it's a very musically driven film. I'll come back to that shortly. But long before the film went into production, so we're back in November 2013, before the movie was officially announced, Carney had a meeting with music producer Kieran Lynch and went to discuss the music of the film. And they started to work from ideas that Carney had, and they started to put the songs together. But they also had a studio band record all the songs before the film started shooting, so that they'd have all these songs available to them when the movie got onto set. Now, there's a little bit of chronology just to work with here, in that the lead in the film, and I'm going to come to his casting shortly, Ferdia Walsh-Pilo would record his own vocals in there. But also, when it came to performing the music, the challenge that Lynch and Carney found was trying to get professional musicians to play a little bit like amateurs. They were trying to capture the sweet spot of what it was like to be playing guitar at 15, that you weren't refined, you were quite raw, but it still had to be good enough to serve in the film. The formal announcement of the movie came in February 2014. It came at the Berlin European Film Market. That at that point it was said that Carney was going to be teaming up with U2, with Bono and The Edge, for what was described, quote, as a semi-autobiographical movie about growing up in Dublin during the 1980s. And so at that stage, Bono and The Edge were going to be involved with the music and other aspects of the film, that Carney was going to produce it through his Distressed Films banner, and also aboard at that point the likes of Anthony Bregman, Kevin Frakes, Rajbinder Singh, and a couple of other financiers. And at that point, the plot was pretty much in place. The film centres on a 14-year-old who's got to break free of a home strained by his parents' relationship, money troubles, deals with his dropout older brother's antics, surviving a new public school, forms a band, runs away to London. And that was, at that stage, the basis of it. And most of that did come through into the final version of the movie as well. At that point, the rights were picked up by an assortment of companies. Lionsgate got them in the UK. Filming was due to begin in the summer of 2014. Now, by the time the film did come to production, Bono and The Edge were pulling out of the movie, and it was a simple case of, whilst they did some collaborative work in the early genesis of the film and they started putting things together, the fact was U2 at this point were going off on tour, and at the point where the film was going to shoot, they wouldn't be available. So whilst their involvement gave the film an initial injection of publicity, and much needed for an independent movie as well, the timing for their greater involvement in that just didn't work out. In came a guy called Gary Clark instead, and the key songs were put together ultimately without U2's involvement. The casting was going to be a problem, though, because John Carney given some, I think you probably admit, clumsy interviews around the time of the film's release, where he talked about his displeasure of working with Keira Knightley on Begin Again. And it'd be fair to say Knightley comes out far classier than John Carney from those exchanges. But he wanted to basically, he didn't want to work with child actors on this one. He knew he needed a young cast, but he was looking for, quote, non-professional actors for the movie. And I did talk to him around the time of the film's release about this. And his problem was that he felt that child actors often had bad habits, and what he didn't want to do when he had a contained shoot for an independent film was to spend his time on set undoing the bad habits. And so thus what he decided to do, he and his team held pretty open auditions for the movie in Ireland, that they put adverts in newspapers, clubs, music halls. They cast the net as wide as they possibly could, and it wasn't a process, Carney would say, that they enjoyed either, because they were casting for young performers. That meant disappointing an awful lot of young people, but he knew what he had to find was not just someone with musical talent. He needed someone with character as well. And it was when Ferdia Walsh-Pilo walked through the door that he knew he had ultimately who he was looking for. That there was a confidence to him that would ultimately reflect the character of Connor Cosmo Lawler, who Ferdia Walsh-Pilo plays in the movie. And that character would reflect some of the actor's confidence and would change as a consequence of the casting. But it wasn't just that wasn't the only thing that changed as a consequence of the casting, because as well as channeling what he brought into the character of Cosmo, basically the band was then cast around him. Once they'd found the lead, they could slot everyone else into place around him. There are a couple of higher profile additions to the cast as well. Maria Doyle Kennedy, Jack Rayner as Cosmo's brother, Aidan Gillen in there as well. But this was primarily a cast of unknowns who came together off the back of that open casting process. It's it's difficult quite to nail down what the chronology of that casting was, but it looked like, because the film would start shooting in September 2014, it looked like those auditions took place in the summer before, so it was pretty close to the line, if I'm reading that correctly. Now, Carney had a plan with Sing Street that what he was looking to do was to basically make a musical in disguise, that he would ultimately go on to tell The Independent he was looking to make, quote, a stealth musical, unquote. That in that he didn't want to tell people they were getting a musical. He didn't want to tell people necessarily he was making a musical. It's certainly known it was going to be a musical film, but that he basically wanted people just to realise that once they got to see it. Now, this is a very marked contrast to, say, something like Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd, where huge efforts were made in the promotion to hide the fact that people were getting a musical when they handed over their money for that one. But nonetheless, there was still the intention that the music, just how musical a movie it was going to be slightly hidden. Now, Carney would also talk just around the same time about how the film evolved as he went along. And he said, quote, a lot of filmmakers claim that this is my vision 5 years ago when I began, and I got exactly that vision. And he says, which to me is crazy talk. And he said he hired different actors, hires 100 people to make the film with him, works with different producers, and it changes. And he liked the fact that the film evolved and was just a little different to how he'd originally envisaged. He liked little touches, like the character of Eamon, actually played him, brought rabbits to the set, and they just left the rabbits in. They're just like, well, why have you brought rabbits? Because people will ask if there's anything to the rabbits, which there wasn't. They just decided to bring some rabbits in. That's the only reason they're in there. I'm very fond of those rabbits. Carney would say, in hindsight, actually, that one thing he feels the film doesn't get right, I'm going to go very spoiler light on this, is the ending of the movie, that he felt people took that quite literally, and even at the point where he was promoting the film, interestingly enough, he felt that the ending was a little bit of a misstep. He also talked about, because one of the things I really love about Sing Street is he actually tries to dig into the idea, to the question of who bullies a bully, to pull back the curtain a little bit on the person who's been really obnoxious and horrible to people and ask what's going on in their home life. And there was a little bit more that was originally intended to be in the film on that storyline that, again, I don't want to do spoilers, but he decided just to pull back on that, and he told me in an interview he sort of regretted that a little bit, that he kind of wished he'd left that in. Before the film wrapped production, there was time for a little bit of location work at Carney's old school, as it would happen, but filming did wrap up at the end of October 2014, and then it was a case of how do you release a small film of this ilk, because it wouldn't actually get its premiere for another 15-16 months after that the decision was made, even though the movie was long completed, to take it to the Sundance Film Festival, and that's where it made its debut on the 24th of January 2016. And it would be fair to say that when Sing Street first played at Sundance, it got a rapturous response at that point. That the response to the first screening was really, really hugely positive. It would then do a few more festival screenings. The idea of rolling out almost a small platform release at this point. So it did the Dublin Film Festival the following month. It went to South by Southwest Festival in March of 2016, before finally getting a wide release in Ireland on the 17th of March 2016. It would follow, it would get its, it would just be a staggered release. It would come out in the US in April 2016, where it didn't make an awful lot of money, really. I mean, the film is a modestly costed film to make in the first place. It cost $4 million. So what's that? Around that time, that'd be about £2.5 million, something like that. And when it came to the UK, Lionsgate had picked up the rights to it, and it knew it had a good film on its hands. It knew it had a really good film on its hands, and it tried a little bit of counter-programming in the UK, and it put the film up against the then juggernaut X-Men Apocalypse, at the point where the X-Men franchise was arguably at its commercial peak. Apocalypse following Days of Future Past, which had been really, really huge. And I did ask him, I did ask Carney about that, how he felt, and he was quote, the X-Men thing is a pain in the arse. Also, we've done the same amount of work, even though it's a small film. Obviously, there's a lot more men and women at computer terminals with X-Men, but in terms of the movie and the love of the movie, we've done the same amount of work as X-Men, but it's sort of like a featherweight getting into the ring with a heavyweight. And as it turned out, well, the battle of the box office, X-Men unsurprisingly prevailed at that point. that X-Men Apocalypse opened in the UK to over £7 million worth of business, playing on over just shy of 600 screens around Britain. But that same weekend, Sing Street opened, playing on fewer than 100, and didn't even break the top 10, sadly enough. But by the time it came to Britain, it was already a hit in Ireland, so it was going to make its money back. That bit wasn't in question. But its UK opening gross was £126,000, and that put it below the one-shot release of Thomas and Friends The Great Race, which I went to see with my kids and was not good. Sing Street, however, really is good. Sing Street is a really terrific film. And one of the questions that was asked around the time of the film's release was, would it follow Carney's other earlier musical film Once and be turned into a Broadway or West End musical? And Carney around the time said that's very dependent on the box office of the film. He described himself as a director who always wants to be making a film or releasing a film, and in fact he's had one or two projects that didn't quite go to plan in the aftermath of Sing Street that haven't come to fruition, and now he's working on a television programme. But it finally, and it's taken a couple of years to get there, earlier this year, nearly 3 years, over 3 years after the film premiered, we got the first noise about a Sing Street musical on the way. And this is a project that's reunited the team that brought Once to the stage. So Carney and Gary Clark have put the music and lyrics together. The book being written by Enda Walsh, who wrote Once. Rebecca Teichman directing, choreography by Sonia Taylor. And the idea, as it was announced, was that the production would debut off-Broadway, and that's exactly what it's done. That the New York Theatre Workshop has put together the production. It's having its world premiere off-Broadway on the 25th of November, and presumably the future of Sing Street and the Sing Street musical will be dependent on how that world premiere goes and what the reaction to it is. But the legacy of Sing Street doesn't deserve to just be tied to that, because it's really a special, really charming and really excellent film. Very musical. The soundtrack itself is worth digging out as well. But it's a film, and it's the reason one of the reasons I featured it in this podcast this week is it's a film that's flown under so many people's radars over the years, and in an era where smaller movies are harder and harder to find, I do encourage you to seek this one out. I think it's an absolute flat out treat. I hugely enjoyed it. I think you'll enjoy it too. I can promise you this, it's a darn sight better than X-Men Apocalypse. And that brings me to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories. I thank you as always for listening. You can hear me or catch up with what I'm doing on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find out more about the whole Film Stories project on our Twitter handle at Film Stories Pod. We've recently relaunched our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Film Stories, and what we're running on there is a whole bunch of exclusive stuff that you don't find on the podcast, you won't find on the website, including most recently a look behind the race car, the racing sequences, and the person who helped perform them in Le Mans 66. So that's youtube.com/Film Stories. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online if you'd like to like us there. And then you can find the website at www.filmstories.co.uk. I've been putting daily news and features on there. The response to that has been great. You can also there find details of the now shipping issue 11 of Film Stories magazine, which is the only film magazine in history, to my knowledge, to mix Last Christmas, David Essex, Pantomime and Judge Dredd. That's on sale. You can also buy Film Stories Junior magazine issue 2. That's primarily written by under 15s, and it's for under 15s as well, and that too is a print film magazine. Thank you so much for your support of the Film Stories project. I'm now off to watch another load of films to put together another podcast, and I'll be back soon with a whole other bunch of film stories. You all take care, and thank you as always for your support. Bye bye.